So we've learned how to protect our networks. We've built this wall around our network with doors in the right places. But now we have to talk about, once we have all that in place, how do we maintain that protection on our network? How do we monitor that? And one of the tools we have for monitoring the network is intrusion detection systems, or IDSs. Now I will tell you that everything I talked about in the previous unit with network security, everything I'm talking about, all these little topics that I talk about in this unit, they're all courses unto themselves. You can take a whole course on intrusion detection systems. You can take a whole course on network security. Network security and firewalls and VPNs, encryption, all these different technologies. And this week is no different. You can take an entire course about intrusion detection systems and proxy servers and so forth, and all these different tools that we talk about. So for intrusion detection systems, there's really two different types, two main categories that we'll talk about. One is a host-based intrusion detection system, which protects a single host, and the other one is a network-based intrusion detection system. They work very similar, but the thing about a network intrusion detection system is it doesn't require components to be installed on every single computer, although it does require quite a bit of configuration to make it work right. And also, it has a larger or wider view of what's happening overall in the network, where a host-based system only knows what's happening on that individual host. It can't put that together with what's happening on the rest of the network to identify a possible attack. So how exactly does an intrusion detection system work? We start with a collector or a sensor, which is basically being fed by critical files, network traffic monitoring, log files. It might be collecting log files from routers, firewalls, switches, all those network devices that we talked about in the previous unit. It might be monitoring those devices, monitoring those files and the log files, and trying to collect all of that stuff to get a picture of what's happening overall over the entire network. And again, if this is just a host-based IDS, then it's only collecting these things from a single host. And you can see how that's a little bit limited in scope. No different than, say, an antivirus. So an analysis engine, basically what happens is all this stuff that's being collected by the sensor and the collector is all being fed into an analysis engine. That analysis engine is looking at all that stuff and comparing it to a database of known attack patterns. So it's looking at all these different things that are known to signify some kind of an attack, and it's trying to alert you based on that stuff. So it might be available to you in a user interface. You might be able to do reporting, and there might be some kind of alarm mechanism to let you know that something has happened. And of course, the IDS gives you a good picture after some kind of an incident as to exactly what happened. So this is roughly how an intrusion detection system works. Just about all the different types of IDSs that your book talks about roughly works in this way. Okay, so intrusion detection and prevention systems. So an intrusion, here we go, sorry. An intrusion occurs when an attacker attempts to gain entry into or disrupt the normal operations of your information systems. That's pretty obvious. So intrusion prevention consists of anything that can deter or detect an intrusion. So with an IDS, we're trying to do both. We're trying to both deter an intrusion, and that could just simply, having an intrusion detection system could deter it, being able to raise those flags when it's happening and so forth. And also we can take steps. Intrusion detection systems in many cases can take steps to automatically attempt to prevent these incursions into our networks, which is good because, by the time you get an alert for a lot of these issues, it may be too late by the time you get an alert from an intrusion detection system. So there are both passive and active. So that's the other term you'll hear to describe intrusion detection systems, where a passive intrusion detection system is sitting in a corner and monitoring everything and letting you know when something is happening that seems suspicious, whereas an active intrusion detection system is taking active steps to try to prevent that intrusion. So that's the other way we subdivide these. So most IDSs can take corrective activities. So in other words, like I said, they can be active. They can be actively trying to identify and prevent the intrusion. So intrusion detection systems detect a violation of its configuration and activate an alarm. So usually they can activate some kind of alarm to notify someone that something is happening. They can enable administrators to configure it to send an email or to page them in real time. And they can be configured to notify an external security service organization of some kind of a break-in. So some of the terminology that you'll see with IDSs, we have alarm clustering and compaction, alarm filtering, alert alarms, confidence value, evasion, and so forth and so on. I don't want to bore you with all these terms, but this is all the vernacular that you might hear with IDS, and your book has a pretty good explanation of each one of these terms that I would suggest getting familiar with. So why use an IDS? Intrusion detection, of course, is the primary purpose. So the primary purpose is to identify and report when there's some kind of an intrusion. And we can pretty much assume if you're not using an intrusion detection system that it's not that the intrusions aren't happening, you just don't know about them. So an IDS just makes sure that you know about all of these incursions into your network. They can contain an attack and prevent any damage. So they can take a proactive approach. They can kick in and try to prevent further intrusions into the network. And they can detect and deal with preambles to attacks. So a preamble to an attack is the steps that attackers will take before they attack a network. So they might do port scanning. They might do use Nmap to do things like fingerprinting services and things like that. So an IDS can detect that reconnaissance is happening and try to shut down before the attack even starts. So usually they have some features to do that as well. So data collection allows you to examine what happened after an intrusion and find out why it happened and how it happened. And it can serve as the deterrent by increasing the fear of detection, which I talked about just a little bit earlier. So there are some different types of IDSs. You have network-based and host-based, which I just talked about. So your network-based IDSs are focused on protecting network information assets. In other words, they look at the entire network, a network-based IDS, whereas let's talk about the host-based first. So here's an example of a host-based IDS. A network-based IDS. So a network-based IDS is monitoring traffic on the network. It's monitoring all of your network devices like firewalls, switches, proxy servers. It's monitoring their log files, and it's aggregating all that information across the entire network, or at least whatever portion of the network you've configured your IDS. So it has a good view of everything that's sort of happening on the network from the network layer. There are certainly things that would slip past a network intrusion detection system that it simply doesn't have access to. For example, if somebody emailed you a virus, a network intrusion detection system is probably not going to detect that. That's something we would use a host-based IDS for. So network-based intrusion detection systems reside on a computer and appliance connected to a segment. So, sorry, this slide is from your book, but so basically they're installed on a server somewhere on the network, and they're configured to look at all of these devices. You have to configure it to connect to and gather all this information that it needs in order to do its network its intrusion detection. So you have to give a permission to all that stuff. So it does require a bit of configuration. To determine whether an attack has occurred or is underway, it compares measured activity to known signatures in some kind of knowledge base, which I talked about earlier. I showed you that graphic where it uses and you can think of that as kind of like signatures. If you're familiar with how an antivirus works, they work by taking a fingerprint of a program and comparing it to known signatures of how viruses work, and that's how they identify them. There's a variety of different methods they use to do that. Some of them are simple as taking a hash of the executable, and some of them can be more complicated, where they look at how the application is actually working. They can be done by using special implementation of the TCP/IP stack, which we learned about in the previous unit. So they can look at all those different layers in TCP/IP and look at the different headers to have some idea of what's happening on the network. So the reason that we would use a network intrusion detection system, they're at the network layer, so they have a much wider view of what's happening overall in the entire network. So it gives you a much better view of what's happening than what you would have if you were looking at a single host. And that's probably the biggest reason that we would want to use a network intrusion detection system. The other reason that network intrusion detection systems are good is it's a layer of protection that you don't have to rely on something being installed or running on the host. So it kind of runs separate and distinct from hosts on the network, so you don't have to install any kind of component on individual hosts. So for example, if you had a bunch of computers on your network and they had a worm, and the antiviruses on those individual computers weren't detecting the worm, the network intrusion detection system probably would detect that worm because it can see the traffic overall, over the whole network. It can see this uptick in traffic that may be indicative of a worm, and it can alert you that that's happening. before a host-based system like an antivirus might even know about that. And even if a host-based system doesn't know about that particular worm. So some disadvantages is they can become overwhelmed by network volume. So if you have a lot of traffic on the network, you need a very high-end IDS to handle all that traffic. It has to have access to all the traffic that it's monitoring. So if you have a lot of encrypted packets on your network, a lot of that will be difficult for the IDS to work with. It doesn't have access to what's happening inside those encrypted packets. It doesn't necessarily know if an attack was successful or not, so you lose a little bit of intelligence with that. And some forms of attack are not easily detected. Like I said, if somebody sends you a virus in an email, a network intrusion detection system will probably not detect that. You would have to rely on host-based systems to do that. So you have wireless, wireless network intrusion detection systems. Wireless network intrusion detection systems, which monitor and analyze wireless traffic or network traffic. There are some issues that are associated with it. Physical security, the range, the access points being compatible, and so forth and so on. But it's certainly one option. Network behavior analysis systems identify problems related to the flow of traffic. So, for example, it can detect things like denial of service attacks that are actively happening, worms, policy violations. It can look for things that are happening that might indicate some violation of policy. And, of course, there's standard things you can do in these IDSs to configure that type of thing. And some of them have prevention capabilities as well as detection. So a host-based IDS, or a HIDS, resides on a computer or on the host itself, a server or a client, and monitors the activity only on that system. So it's very similar to an antivirus. In fact, many antiviruses, in addition to being an antivirus, are also a host-based intrusion detection system. And if you have some kind of enterprise license for one of those systems, you can have sort of a network of these host intrusion detection systems that are centrally managed, which certainly makes it a little bit easier to manage all of these HIDs that are laying around all over the network. So they can detect local events on the system and detect attacks that may slip past an network-based intrusion detection system. So they focus only on that system. They can see encrypted traffic in many cases because the traffic is not encrypted until it leaves that computer. So sometimes they can hook into the traffic before it goes through those processes that do the encryption, depending on what application is sending the traffic. It's not affected by the use of a switched network protocol. It can detect inconsistencies in how applications and system programs were used by examining records stored in audit logs. So it can use all of those logs that are baked into, say, Windows or Linux. And by the way, there are host-based intrusion detection systems for both Windows and Linux. They work very different because of the way those applications work, but you can use them on both. They have versions of these for both. So the disadvantage, obviously management issues. If you have thousands and thousands of computers on the network and you have to install an IDS on all of them, that does pose some management issues. They're vulnerable to attack in some cases against the host operating system. They will not detect things that sometimes a network-based IDS will detect. So there are some things that are detected better by network-based and some better by host-based. They are susceptible to denial of service attacks. They might use a lot of disk space, and not only that, sometimes they use a lot of processing time. So if they're monitoring, for example, all of the network traffic that's leaving or coming into that computer, they could use a lot of resources, and that's certainly a concern. I'm sure a lot of you have had an instance where your antivirus is using a lot of your processing time and memory because it's actively doing a scan. So you might choose to disable it for a period of time because maybe you're working on something and you don't want it to be in your way. Well, with an intrusion detection system, imagine that type of scanning is constantly happening on all your network traffic. That could slow things down a little bit. And the thing is, usually when you have a network-based IDS, you're only affecting the processing time on that network-based server. And usually they're optimized to handle, the architecture of the hardware and the software is designed to handle those heavy loads of traffic. And they can do that because of the control that they have and because it's a specialized operating system. But we don't have that when we're installing some software on an existing host. It kind of has to live within that ecosystem, and it may not be as efficient. So that's certainly another big downside to host-based systems. So there are different detection methods One method of detection is signature-based, where we examine either network traffic or a program itself, like an antivirus might want, for patterns that match known signatures or known patterns. So ways that we know attacks happen. It's used because most attacks have a very clear and distinct signature. So you can be pretty sure that if you see a certain pattern, that it's probably a certain type of attack. The problem is that any new attack patterns have to be added to the database over time, and if it's not there, then you're going to miss those types of attacks. So you have to constantly keep the signature database updated. So maybe the vendor or manufacturer, the IDS that you're using, might put out updates, and if you fail to do that, then you may not catch some of those attacks. And here's the other thing, is that some intrusions are not automated. It might be a human that's doing it, and it's much more difficult to detect those patterns because it's not a program doing it that you can always see the same pattern. So for example, if you're using Nmap to port scan a network, and we'll talk about some of these tools in the other presentation, but if you're using something like Nmap, it has a certain signature, it has a certain pattern in how it does its reconnaissance. But I could also do the exact same thing myself, just using the command line and telnetting to ports and so forth. And that's not going to have as much of a pattern. I can kind of switch things up in such a way that it's much more difficult to detect that pattern. And you can see that when you take other courses like IT Security 2, we actually will try that. And there's some other courses in the program where you can, like Nessus courses and things like that, where you'll see that. So the other type is anomaly-based detection, which is behavior-based detection, which collects statistics and summaries by observed traffic that's known to be normal. And when activity is outside the baseline parameters, then we know something is wrong. I'll give an example of that. Let's say at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, historically our network traffic has always been at a certain level. And one day the IDS notices that for a sustained period of time, the network traffic has far exceeded that normal level. That would raise an alert because something probably is wrong. Something's not right. Something just doesn't feel right, right? So it does require more overhead and processing capacity than signature-based. It's obviously a lot more complicated. And you get false positives. Maybe somebody's just downloading a really large file at that time of the day for some reason. And then you'll do all this work because you got an alert only to realize that it was just somebody downloading an ISO of an operating system or something, and it took forever, and it was, killing your network. So stateful protocol analysis, or SPA, is comparing known normal or benign protocol profiles against observed traffic. So when we know how a protocol works and we know the patterns that protocol uses, we can kind of compare that to what's happening in real time and see if it's outside the norm. So this is another detection method, or SPA. So some drawbacks, it's very complex, it takes a lot of processing, and it may fail to detect an intrusion unless the protocol violates some fundamental behavior. I'll give you an example of this. Most of us view a web page by opening up Internet Explorer, going to a web page. We go to www.drexel.edu, for example. The web page comes up in our browser, and there's certain things that are happening under the hood that allow that to happen. So your browser is sending some commands in HTTP to the server, getting a response back, and displaying it for the user. And that all happens very quickly, and so forth and so on. But I, as an attacker, maybe I want to see some additional information. And the only way to do that is, instead of opening up a web browser, I telnet directly to the web server's port, and I look at the information that the web server is sending back. But because I'm a human interacting with the server, I might be making little mistakes, or I might have little idiosyncrasies that are not common when the connection's coming from a browser. And the IDS would see that and say, something isn't right here. The way that this client is trying to connect to the web server just doesn't meet the normal parameters of how somebody connects to that server with that protocol. So it might flag that connection as a possible intrusion or some kind of reconnaissance attempt, and then flag it. And of course, somebody could go and investigate that. Or it might just shut me down. I've had that happen when I'm trying to troubleshoot with a web server, and I'm using some tools that are not the web browser, something like Postman or something like that. And an IDS will detect that traffic as being outside the norm and will shut down my access for a while. Another way that IDSs work is by monitoring log files. There is a tremendous amount of information in log files that are all over the network. So here's the thing. You've got routers, you've got switches, you have firewalls. If you have a firewall that receives traffic and it drops the traffic because the rules say not to pass the traffic, that gets logged. That goes into a log file somewhere. Usually it's FIFO, so if I first in, first out, it's constantly cycling, so it doesn't stay in there forever, but that information is logged. Somebody tries to log into a server and they're rejected because they used the wrong password. That gets logged. The problem is all of these things are getting logged in individual servers that are splattered across the entire network. There's no one single repository for all of these things, and that's where an IDS comes in. So an IDS can aggregate all of that logging. It's looking at all the logging. You tell it where all these different devices are on the network, and it can put that all together to get one picture. So if you're seeing failed login attempt from, a failed login attempt on its own is not a huge security concern. And a port scan on its own is not a huge security concern. And, and so forth and so on. But when those things are all happening from a certain subnet or from a certain region or something like that the IDS can detect, then all of a sudden it becomes a much bigger concern and it can shut that down. So it sort of gets that big picture view by collecting these log files. Now, whether it's host-based or network-based, it can use the log file monitors. So even on host-based, you can set it up to use log files. You can configure it to look at different log files. For example, in Windows, you've got different logs that log, security things like a failed login attempt, somebody trying to access a file that they're not supposed to access, all those sorts of things that an IDS might be able to monitor. So response behavior. So an IDS response to external stimulation depends on the configuration and function. Many response options are available. Boy, that sounds like it's right out of marketing. But the response to be classified as active or passive, which I've talked about before. So active response is where we're collecting additional information about the intrusion, maybe modifying something. So I'll give you an example of that. If we detect that there is a port scan coming from a certain IP address, we might go in and make it so that that IP is now blocked. We can actually go into the firewall. The IDS will go to the firewall and say, you should now block this IP address so it can no longer access the network. And then that person will no longer be able to run their port scan. They won't be able to do anything for a period of time. And then usually you'll back that off after a certain period of time. That way you're just blocking it for a period. That way, if it's legitimate traffic, they're not, forever blocked from your network. A passive response is simply in notifying somebody that something is happening. So you're just simply collecting the information, sitting in a corner, and you're letting somebody know that, hey, something is happening, but you're not taking any active response to counteract that intrusion. So IDSs can generate routine reports and other detailed documents, which you saw in my diagram in the very beginning, and can protect IDSs from being circumvented. Fail-safe features, that is. All right, so selecting an IDS, technical and policy considerations. What is your system environment, security goals and objectives, existing security policy? So you want to make sure that the IDS that you choose is going to support your security policy. Again, we always start with the policy, right? We don't take the technology that's available to us within our budget and say, okay, that's how we're going to design our policy. It's better to come up with your policy first and then try to find a way to design to enforce that policy. So that's one approach that your book does talk about. Although, in some cases we have, the best intentions in the world with our policy and there's no technology that can support that, that certainly would be a concern. What is the environment? Are you mostly Linux? Is it mostly Windows? What vendor are you using for your routers, firewalls, and switches? Some IDSs may work better with certain vendors than others. There may also be some requirements and constraints. So what requirements outside the organization, what kind of resource constraints might there be? They could be financial, they could be technical constraints, they could be resource constraints. You don't have enough people to manage this sort of thing. So those things you have to think about. For example, you might be able to get a nice open source IDS, but it requires a lot of manpower to configure it, but you don't have a lot of manpower. So you might spend more money on a commercial product that has 100% support where they set it up for you. And if you have a problem, you can always just pick up the phone and call them and ask them to fix the problem for you. So features and quality. Is the product sufficiently scalable for your environment? Can it handle the traffic load, especially if it's a network-based IDS? If you've got a really big network, an enterprise network with multiple locations, multinational, whatever, or you have a tremendous amount of data, those are things certainly to take into account of how you're going to implement this IDS. How has the product been tested, either by the vendor or if it's open source? The level of expertise that's targeted by the product. So how much expertise do you have to manage that product? Can it evolve as the organization grows or as the threats change and things like that? And what kind of support does it have? Open source, for example, traditionally doesn't have great support, but sometimes you can pay companies that do have excellent support for those products. Sometimes the commercial products are a little bit better because the support is baked into the product. But at the same time, sometimes if you don't pay for the support, it becomes very difficult to do anything with it because there's no one else really that can help you. All right, so some strengths and limitations. So IDSs are good for monitoring and analysis of system events and behaviors, testing security states, baselining, which is establishing what the normal situation looks like, what a normal environment looks like, and then being able to compare that to when things stray outside the norm, recognizing patterns. Computers are great at recognizing patterns, recognizing activity that varies from normal activity, which we would have discovered from the baseline. So some other things that they do well: managing, auditing, and logging, because they can aggregate all that stuff, which we can't do without something like an IDS. Alerts and notifications, measuring enforcement of the policy, providing default information on security policies, allowing non-security experts to perform important security monitoring functions. In other words, if you don't know the ins and outs of network security, you don't know at the very low level how TCP works, an IDS still allows somebody like that to monitor the network without having all that expertise. What they cannot perform well: weak or missing security mechanisms. So your firewall is not configured properly. It's not really going to do much for you. So that base has to be in place. Instantaneously detecting, reporting, and responding to an act when there's heavy network or processing load. And that's certainly one of the strategies that some attackers will use. They'll try to overwhelm those systems and try to sort of distract them while they're trying to do whatever it is they're trying to do. Detecting new attacks or variations on existing attacks. Until we get really good artificial intelligence, we're not going to have really a good way of detecting these new attacks. Although it seems like systems are getting better at that. Effectively responding to attacks by sophisticated attackers when it's not within a known pattern. They're not very good at thinking on their feet like a human is, and automatically investing in attacks without human intervention. So these are some of the things that you really can't rely on an IDS to do. It's important to be aware of some of these things that they're not very good at. Resisting attacks intended to defeat or circumvent them, compensating for problems with fidelity of information sources, dealing effectively with switched networks. In other words, with switched networks, if you have an IDS that's monitoring an entire enterprise through many different layers, across many different networks, through VPNs and things like that, certainly that's a lot of complexity. You might have to have an IDS that's more central, that's more located regionally as opposed to centrally, that runs the entire enterprise. So an IDS can be implemented via one of three basic control strategies. You can use a centralized, fully distributed, or partially distributed, which I kind of just described. So centralized is where everything is managed and controlled from a central location, and distributed is where the IDS can be physically located in different networks. So for example, if you had a multinational company with 27 offices, you could go with a centralized approach, and the advantage with centralized would be that you have one place to manage all this stuff, but you would need a pretty powerful IDS with a lot of features to do that. So instead, you could distribute it where you've got 27 instances of the IDS running across the enterprise, and each one of them sort of manages itself, and you can even have local management of the IDS and customize it for each environment, but then you have more management involved. And a partially distributed is where maybe you have a distributed IDS that's centrally managed. So a central management console that can manage all of these different distributed IDSs that are out in the different physical locations. So that would be sort of a hybrid of the two. So here is a graphic from your textbook showing a typical implementation of an intrusion detection system. Basically just showing you how we have all these different components in the network, and the IDS is sort of looking at and monitoring all of this stuff. And here's a different from your textbook, a different image from your textbook showing a typical IDS configuration. And you can see it gets more and more complicated, right? So we have multiple locations in this example. This one we might have a distributed. This would be the hybrid where it's both distributed and centrally managed. So as far as deployment of an IDS, you have to take some care in deciding where you're going to locate the components, select some kind of a strategy that's based on your organization's needs and minimizes downtime and so forth. You have to remember that we have to, sometimes traffic has to get shunted through IDSs, so it might require some network configuration changes. We have to make sure we don't have an impact on the network when we're doing those sorts of things. Lots of testing. Sometimes it's helpful to have a test environment to do all this stuff. So deploying a network-based IDSs, you have, according to the National Institutes of Standards, there are 4 recommendations. You can put it behind each external firewall in the DMZ. You put it outside an external firewall, on a major network backbone, and on critical subnets. So those are the 4 locations that they recommend. So here's an example of an IDS in each of those 4 locations. So you can see we've got the internet. Location 1 is behind the firewall to the entrance to the DMZ. Location 2 is in front of the firewall. So you're monitoring traffic before it gets to the firewall, and you're monitoring what gets past the firewall into the DMZ. And then in locations 3 and 4, so in location 3, we might be monitoring traffic on subnets, individual subnets, and also on major backbones. So a host-based IDS deployment, the biggest task here with IDS deployment in a host-based method is all of the time it takes to deploy it to all the workstations on the network. So one tool that you have is there are tools for deployment on networks that you can use. Microsoft Active Directory has a way to do that. And some of the IDS vendors also have tools that allow you to distribute over the network. They have different ways to do that. If you have a domain controller and you put in the domain administrator's password, you have unfettered access, and it can go and install itself to all of the computers on the network. Sometimes you can put a minimal installation on each computer, and then it will go out and get all the components it needs and configure it. So you've got a couple different options, but again, that's the biggest concern, is how to get that IDS, that host-based IDS, on all of the computers that it needs to be on. And I should tell you that sometimes in many networks, we only use the host-based IDS, and your book doesn't talk about this very much, but I've seen in many cases where the host-based IDSs are mostly running on servers and not really on workstations. So they'll run them on the server side, but not so much on the workstations, because that's really what's critical, the server. And on the workstation, they just rely on an antivirus and the network intrusion detection systems in place. And again, it depends on the level of protection that you require in your network. So as far as measuring the effectiveness of intrusion detection systems, we can use 4 metrics: thresholds, blacklists, whitelist, alert settings, and code viewing and editing. So an evaluation of IDS might read at 100 megabits per second, the IDS was able to detect 97% of directed attacks. In other words, many IDSs, they're not going to slow down your network to evaluate the network traffic. They just have to keep up with that traffic. So because developing this collection can be tedious, most vendors provide some mechanism to verify systems are performing as expected. But as anything else, always take those tools with a grain of salt. Some of these testing processes will enable administrators to record and retransmit packets from real virus or worm scan, record or retransmit packets from real virus or worm scan with incomplete sessions, missing SYN packets, for example, which is how DDoS attacks work, conduct a real or virus or worm scan against hundreds or hardened or sacrificial systems to test the effectiveness of the IDS. In other words, you can test, what they're talking about in the book is that you can test your IDS to see how well it holds up against real attacks, because you know what you're throwing at the IDS and you can measure what it was able to detect. Kind of like the TSA does, right? You always hear these stories about the TSA where somebody will test TSA by putting a bag full of bombs through their, pack their suitcase full of guns and knives or something, and they see if TSA detects it. They do those periodic tests to see how well their people are able to detect those things. I think they fail pretty much every test, but, or at least they, maybe detect some things and not others. But so testing process should be as realistic as possible, just like the TSA tests. All right, so that concludes the information about IDSs. I'm also going to talk about some tools that we have available to us to manually monitor our network and manually determine how secure our networks are. So we'll talk about those in the next presentation.